This is the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast, brought to you by Heather Rose Jones. The show looks at lesbian and sapphic themes in history and literature, and historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past. We present research, interviews, news of the field, book listings, and original historical fiction for your enjoyment. For even more historic research, check out our blog. Welcome to On the Shelf for August 2024. Thank goodness for pre-scheduled podcasts, because when this show is going live, assuming that nothing untoward happens in the meantime, I am in Iceland, having a brief stopover on my way to Scotland, where I'll be attending the World Science Fiction Convention, and then doing a couple weeks of sightseeing. I hope to have all sorts of fun tidbits to report in next month's On the Shelf. I'll be doing at least one interview for the podcast at the convention, and my sightseeing will include doing some deep background location research for a couple different fiction projects. Plus, I'm hoping to make a sort of pilgrimage to Halifax to visit Shibden Hall. The last time I traveled for an entire month like this was back in 1999, so we'll see what my stamina is like a quarter century later. Barring unexpected complications, and I keep mentioning that because my life has had a few too many unexpected complications lately, I'll also have pre-scheduled this month's essay, the first half of an Our Favorite Tropes episode on theater and actresses in historic romance. Then, when I get home at the end of the month, assuming everything happens on schedule, I'll have a sound file from one of my narrators waiting for me, and we'll have another fiction episode to round out August. As you may have noticed, the episode with Elizabeth Birdsall's The Font of Liberty should have been scheduled in June, but things worked out to move it to a month later, and I took the opportunity to have a brief break from writing new episodes and put it in the essay slot. But now we should be back on the default schedule of posting fiction on 5th Saturdays. I've been having my regular mid-year panic attack about whether I'm doing the fiction series again next year. When I was freaking out a little about finding narrators, I was really dithering. And since next year is my retirement year, I'm going to need to take a hard look at the finances of the fiction series. But at the moment, I'm still defaulting to doing it for another year. The blog has seen a lot of new material this past month, all focused on research for the Tropes double feature about actresses in theater. I blogged a collection entitled Women Players in England, 1500 to 1660, Beyond the All-Male Stage, which contained 14 articles. The contents were of variable relevance to my purposes, but several were quite valuable on the subject of what women were doing on stage at various times and locations, especially when one expands the question beyond professional paid acting companies. Next was a dissertation rather than a published work, The Salon and the Stage, Women in Theatre in 17th Century France, by Elizabeth Grist. Only a few bits focused on women participating in theatre, but those bits were quite interesting. Michael Shapiro's Gender in Play on the Shakespearean Stage, Boy Heroines or Female Pages, was predictably more about the gender dynamics of having male actors play female roles, including female characters then disguising themselves as men, than about women in theatrical professions. But the book opens with a chapter on the social context of women cross-dressing in actual life, which is more generally relevant to the project. Finally, I have a somewhat scanty summary of Sophie Tomlinson's Women on Stage in Stuart Drama, which is a socio-political history of the female presence in dramatic works, though not always about women performers. And that wraps up my Deep Focus series on theater history. I probably won't blog any new publications read in August because I'll be traveling for the whole month, but I hope my momentum picks up again when I get back. It feels good to be blogging this much again. To balance that out, I didn't pick up any new research books this month, but I suspect maybe next month will make up for that. New fiction also seems a bit sparse this month. I have one correction to last month's listings. I had Tasha Suri's The Lotus Empire as a July book, which was the schedule when I first put it in my spreadsheet, but evidently publication was pushed back to November, so I'll try to remember to mention it again then. There's also one August book that I'm saving for next month, in part because the publisher doesn't have a link up yet, and in part because I'm planning to interview the author for the September show. That leaves us with a half dozen items for this month, less than our usual haul. First up is a twofer, because the release of the second book in a series brought the first one to my attention as well. Rachel Ford's Meredith and Alec Thatch mystery series is a bit easy to overlook as sapphic fiction because it involves a closeted couple with a female-husband marriage in 1920s England. The first volume, Murder by Multiples, came out last year and is available for free if you sign up for the author's newsletter. Quiet Fenwood-on-Sea is the perfect place for an heiress with secrets to hide. Or a killer. Beautiful heiress Meredith Thatch married for love and scandalized her community in the process. But her neighbors don't know the half of it. These days, she and spouse Alec keep a low profile, managing her hospital for recovering soldiers and invalids and growing the finest roses in the county. But when the most despised landowner in the area winds up dead shortly after feuding with the hospital, the finger of suspicion turns on the couple. And that's only the first murder. With a Scotland Yard inspector asking uncomfortable questions and a killer on the loose, they need to solve the crime sooner rather than later. But how can they find a killer when there are suspects everywhere they turn and motives all over the place? The second book in the series, Murder by Rote, is the new release that caught my attention. Aunt Anne's house parties are to die for. Sometimes, literally. When heiress Meredith Thatch accepted an invitation to a house party on her aunt's country estate, she expected an exciting weekend for herself and partner Alec. The worst storm in decades wasn't in the cards, though. Neither was murder. Then a guest winds up dead in suspicious circumstances, and the only road in the area washes out. Trapped in the manor, with every guest a possible suspect and everyone harboring secrets, Meredith and Alec race to find the murderer, before their own secret comes out. Or the killer strikes again. Next up, we have what looks like a short story, or maybe a novelette, Shadow of the Moon by T. Lona. Eleanor Wren, a young woman of privilege in Victorian England, finds herself constrained by societal expectations and her father's ambitions. While her father arranges her marriage to Edward Lancaster, Eleanor secretly harbors feelings for her friend Lydia Blackwood. As Eleanor navigates the complex social landscape, she uncovers a hidden family secret that challenges everything she knows about her heritage. With Lydia's support, Eleanor must decide between following her heart and conforming to society's expectations. The Palace of Eros by Caro de Robertis from Atria Books is set in a mythological Greece with direct participation of the gods. I waver a bit on whether stories like this can be shoehorned into the historic fantasy category, as opposed to pure fantasy. But since almost all sapphic romances set in ancient Greece have mythic elements, I'd be eliminating the category entirely if I had strict limits. Young, headstrong Psyche has captured the eyes of every suitor in town and far beyond with her tempestuous beauty, which has made her irresistible as a woman, yet undesirable as a wife. Secretly, she longs for a life away from the expectations and demands of men. When her father realizes that the future of his family and town will be forever cursed unless he appeases an enraged Aphrodite, he follows the orders of the oracle, tying Psyche to a rock to be ravaged by a monstrous husband. And yet, a monster never arrives. When Eros, non-binary deity of desire, sees Psyche, she cannot fulfill her promise to her mother Aphrodite to destroy the mortal young woman. Instead, Eros devises a plan to sweep Psyche away to an idyllic palace hidden from the prying eyes of Aphrodite, Zeus, and the outside world. There, against the dire dictates of Olympus, Eros and Psyche fall in love. Each night, Eros visits Psyche under the cover of impenetrable darkness, where they both experience untold passion and love. But each morning, Eros flies away before light comes to break the spell of the palace that keeps them safe. Before long, Psyche's nights spent in pleasure turn to days filled with doubts as she grapples with the cost of secrecy and the complexities of freedom and desire. Restless and spurred by her sisters to reveal Eros's true nature, she breaks her trust and forces a reckoning that tests them both and transforms the very heavens. I thought rather hard about including the next title, also set in classical Greece, for entirely different reasons. And this is going to sound a little harsh. I don't normally filter books for inclusion in the podcast based on writing quality. Because such a large proportion of sapphic historicals are published independently, and because my goal is the support and encouragement of the field, regardless of the author's background, I consider my job to be the simple presentation of information. But sometimes I do want to put a caveat on a listing, either because I'm concerned about how it handles a sensitive topic, or for some other reason. In the case of Teleios, Flaw is Perfect, by Asvoria K., when I looked at advanced reviews to confirm that the book has sapphic content, the reviews were in agreement that the writing has some serious quality issues. The author's website notes that English is not her first language, which may go some way to explaining this. So if the cover copy strikes your interest, you may well enjoy the story, but be aware of what you're getting. In the dusk of Hellas, the shadow of Rome began to stretch its dominance. Arete of Syracuse had lost her father and her beloved city. Following his last wish, Arete embarked on her odyssey to stop the strange malevolent forces behind which controlled the Roman Emperor Nero. Guided by a determination in her heart, Arete traveled to the fabled city of Oriopolis to find a mysterious Teleios, the perfect woman who was rumored to be the living Aphrodite. Along her journey, traveling through different villages and cities, she fought against ferocious creatures and forged unbreakable bonds with a diverse cadre of companions, each carrying the weight of their own life in their hearts. What will transpire throughout their perilous journey that will shape their destinies? And what evil forces would seek to capture the Teleios for their own sinister ends? The Roaring Twenties continue to be a popular setting for historic romance. Check out Craze by Margaret Vandenberg from Jaded Ibis Press. Fresh off the boat from Roaring Twenties Paris, Henry Adams lands in New York in the midst of the queer craze that is taking the city by storm. An art critic by day and lady lover by night, she ventures into the clandestine worlds of speakeasies and drag balls, which free her from the tyranny of the gender binary. Fun-loving slummers crash the party, flocking to see queer performers at the Astor Hotel and the Cotton Club. Broadway stars rub elbows with Harlem Renaissance luminaries at the Hamilton Lodge Masquerade Ball. But the revelry can't last forever. Faced with Depression-era crackdowns, Henry calculates the risk of fighting back, prompting a decision with far-reaching consequences. For those looking for a book aimed at somewhat younger readers, or maybe you like YA books yourself, Not for the Faint of Heart by Lex Croucher from Bloomsbury Children's Books takes on the Robin Hood legend with a twist. "You aren't Mary," said Clem to her captor, "and you aren't all men, so there's been some marketing confusion somewhere along the line." Mariel, a newly blooded and perpetually grumpy captain of the Merry Men, is desperate to live up to the legacy of her grandfather, the legendary Robin Hood. Clem, a too perky backwoods healer known for her newfangled cures, just wants to help people. When Mariel's ramshackle band of bandits kidnap Clem as a retribution for her guardian helping the Sheriff of Nottingham, all seems to be going sort of to plan, until Jack Hartley, Mariel's father and commander of the Merry Men, is captured in a deadly ambush. Determined to prove herself, Mariel sets out to get him back, with her annoyingly cheerful kidnappee in tow. But the wood is at war. Many believe the Merry Men are no longer on the right side of history. Watching Clem tend the party's wounds and crack relentlessly terrible jokes, Mariel begins to doubt the noble cause to which she has devoted her life. As the two of them grow closer, forced by circumstances to share a single horse and bed, one thing is clear: they must prepare to fight for their lives and for those of everyone they've sworn to protect. I've put one title in the Other Books of Interest category because, despite being tagged as sapphic on the website where I spotted it, I can't figure out the details from the cover copy. This is Accidental Darlings by Crystal Jeans from the Burrow Press. In the night, I slept with my head under a shawl, listening to the ceaseless low groans of the house, telling myself that my mother would never have sent me to live with a murderer, or a witch, or a Miss Havisham. 1924. When Anastasia's beloved mother dies, she has no choice but to go to rural Skimpole and move in with the aunt, too fearsome for a first name, an outcast from the village who lives in a dilapidated mansion with 2 servants and an unruly pack of dogs. The many mysteries of Skimpole are irresistible. How did Anastasia's father really die? Who wrote the extremely raunchy love letter she has found in the aunt's bedroom, signed Big Willie? And why does everyone in the village hate the aunt so much? When some of the aunt's friends from her youth arrive at the house, wreathed in cigarette smoke and an air of debauchery, Anastasia may be closer to finding answers. But the truth she was so desperate to uncover will turn her entire world upside down. And what have I been reading in the last month? It's been all audiobooks, as is often the case, in part because I've been doing so much print reading for the blog. I rather enjoyed A Bluestocking's Guide to Decadence in Jess Everly's Lucky Lovers of London series. It's a Victorian-era sapphic romance that's part of a loosely braided series where the other titles feature gay male romances. I hope it's okay to say that I liked this more than I expected to, in part because I'm coming out of a run of historic romances that rather fell down on the historic side. But Everly sets up a solidly believable context for her ill-matched lovers, including a glimpse of what parts of society might find same-sex couples well within the non-conformity they're happy to accommodate. The miscommunications and anxieties that put stumbling blocks in the path to happiness are all plausible. There was a new release in the Mr. Darcy and Miss Tilney Historic Mystery Series, featuring the neurodivergent son of Darcy and Lizzie, and the adventure-seeking daughter of the protagonists of Northanger Abbey. In Claudia Gray's The Perils of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, the 2 young sleuths are summoned to Rosings Park to figure out who seems to be trying to kill Lady Catherine. The mystery plot was slightly flawed in that I quickly figured out who done it, based on which character the protagonists were obviously overlooking in their considerations. Although the theme of being overlooked and ignored aligned with the motive. But we get further slow progress in the budding romance between Jonathan Darcy and Juliet Tilney at a believable and satisfactory pace that ensures the series is likely to continue for further developments. And finally, I went on a deliberate hunt to fill in the gaps in my K.J. Charles collection and listened to Unfit to Print, a second-chance romance overlaying a mystery involving the Victorian pornography industry, with a delightfully diverse cast. The only minor disappointment was how abruptly the mystery plot was resolved at the end, with almost no input from the protagonists. A happy ending, but not an entirely satisfying one in terms of pacing. For next month, we'll see what effects travel has on my reading. Sometimes I find myself ripping through things quickly on planes and trains, and sometimes I'm so busy having fun I forget to read. To finish up, we have an author guest this month. I'm talking to Melissa Addy, a prolific author of historical fiction. Welcome to the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast, Melissa.
Thank you, Heather. It's really nice to be here.
Why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. So I mostly write historical fiction. I've dabbled in other things, but that's mostly my area. I have written over the eras. I era skip. I know some people really stick to one era and work their way through many, many novels, but I skip a little bit. So I've done ancient Rome, medieval Morocco, 18th century China, and now I'm doing Regency England. And I think I'm beginning to think of myself as a sort of wandering minstrel, making my way through the different eras, finding stories that I like and sharing those. And I live in London in the UK with my husband and 2 kids and a cat who really enjoys the editing process because she likes lying on all the waste paper. So I'm about to edit a novel. She's rubbing her paws in anticipation.
So, yes, you mentioned the various series you've done. So what interested you in these particular settings? So China, Morocco, ancient Rome.
Yeah, I often refer to it as the footnotes of history. I'll find usually a very small mention of something that makes me think, well, what was that again? Let me just check what that was. So the Chinese series started because there's a legend called the Fragrant Concubine, which is half true, half a lot of legends built up around this woman. And I read 2 such incredibly different versions of it, with one with a very happy ending and one with a very tragic ending. And I thought, that's funny. Legends normally mostly stick to the one direction of it. So I went off and researched that. That then took me into 18th century China. Medieval Morocco I went on a trip to Morocco, and they were talking about the amazing silver jewelry that the Berber people wear in Morocco. And I just thought, wouldn't it be cool if the whole book was shaped around the jewelry that this woman got given? So that kicked off a Moroccan series. Ancient Rome was because I wondered, we talk so much about the gladiators and all of that, but I thought, who's the backstage team then of the Colosseum? You can't put on a show that big without a backstage team. And the weird thing is there's so much information on Romans and so much on the Colosseum and gladiators, nothing on the backstage team. So I mean, if you're a historical writer, that's a gift to have a whole load of that authentic setting and then a nice big gaping hole that you can work your way into and just make up anything you like. So I had a lot of fun with that. And now I'm moving into Regency England, and it's the nearest one to home, so it's been quite nice. All the research trips have been much easier to do, less exotic, but a lot of fun. So it's nice to each time start afresh.
So the book of special relevance to this podcast, it's been out for a while, I think published back in 2017.
Yeah.
And that's part of your Chinese series.
Yep.
It's titled The Consorts. It came out right around the time when I first started doing the new releases listings on this podcast. So I didn't pick up on it at that time. So let's talk about it now.
Yeah. So it's a novella. It's a prequel novella. So I wrote the first book in the Chinese series, and then I started thinking actually this would be quite good as a series. So each one is a standalone, but as you read each one, you're meeting the same characters again, and you're kind of going, oh, that's them. That's why they behaved that way in the other book, and that you get a bit more insight into them. So the Consorts is so each story is mostly focused on one concubine in China's Forbidden City, 18th century. So the emperor has a ton of concubines. There's dozens of them of varying hierarchical ranks. I just remember thinking the sort of classic trope for this would be, out of the dozens of concubines, you are the one that falls in love with the emperor and the emperor falls in love with you. How wonderful and romantic. And I remember thinking, well, I just don't buy that for what happens to all the other dozens of them, that doesn't happen, right? And I thought, how would you navigate your way through a very odd life? On the one hand, huge luxury. On the other hand, you are only there for the emperor. And what if he's not that into you? What if he's not? And then what if you're not that into him as well? And I thought, okay, so I started with this concubine who's just never really taken his fancy. And they come in incredibly young. They're between 13 and 16 when they enter the Forbidden City. They know nothing. And she's just lived this very solitary life, really. There's a lot of rivalry, so friendships are not that easy to make. The emperor's not that into her. She's not that into him. So she's just sort of got more and more kind of closed off in her own little world. She has a very nice sort of head of her household staff, who's a eunuch called Bao, who looks after her and is very kind to her. But she's lonely, basically. And every year, new concubines arrive. So every year there's this big new influx of concubines. So every year you become less and less interesting because there's fresh new faces at court and everybody gets their rivalry elbows out again and has another go at trying to get higher up the hierarchies. And a new concubine arrives who reaches out to her and wants to be a friend and wants to spend time with her. And this is, to her, it's just magical to actually be happy in this place because she's just not been all this time. And so they develop a friendship at first, and then as the different seasons go by, this becomes something more between them. I can't go with the spoilers. There's a point where it suddenly becomes clear that actually this is a romantic interest between the two of them. And then it's very difficult for her to navigate the aftermath of what happens. And it's sort of trying to deal with all the rivalries that are going on at court because she's a minor player. She's getting used as a pawn a lot. So she's getting moved around the board by much higher ranking ladies of the court and being used in certain ways. And then at the end, it's romantic. So it ends the way romances are supposed to end. But yes, I just thought, fine, that trope is fine. But I reckon out of dozens and dozens of women, there must have been other routes through this life, and that was one of them. And for each book, I kind of explored a different way that you might be happy, that might not always be that trope.
So have you ever thought about doing another sapphic romance?
Well, someone else asked me that, and I said, when the character turns up, they will get their book. If they turn up, they turn up. And I've just finished my first Regency romance. It's just about to go into editing. And as I was writing that, and again, the idea with this is standalone novels. Everybody gets their own book. You only meet them briefly at balls or whatever, and you'll get a little glimpse of that character, and then you'll find them somewhere else. I had a character, the minute she opened her mouth, I started writing, the minute she opened her mouth, I just went, oh, you're quite an interesting character. Like some of them were just whatever, I'm not that interested, and they're just there to make conversation. And this one, the minute she opened her mouth, I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna write you down on my list of future novels. So I think she may be a couple of books away yet, but she definitely drew attention to herself. And it was funny because then I sent the novel to beta readers, and immediately everybody went, does she get one? Does she get a novel? And I was like, yeah, she gets a novel. She gets a novel. So yeah.
Yeah, and evidently, Sapphic Regencies is becoming quite the thing currently. So you're on
Yes.
track to be part of a trend.
Yes. Well, I wondered that because I remember thinking what I didn't really know that much about Regency romance, so I kind of read my way around a few things, and I was trying to see what are the trends, and are there queer romances, and what's the rules around here? How many sex scenes do you have to have, and all of that. I was trying to feel my way around. And yeah, I could see that was a developing trend. So that would be something nice to be part of, perhaps.
So I'm curious, given that you're doing these more traditional historic romances, how have you found the reception to differ?
From the different eras, or that it's a sapphic romance?
For the sapphic versus the heterosexual.
I think my regular readers, they were like, okay, cool. They're used to me hopping around between different characters, and those characters are diverse in other ways. And I think they were like, okay, great. They'd come across those characters already before as a minor in the background, and they when they saw them come forwards and have their own story, that was already knew them. The sex scenes were quite funny because I wouldn't say I was that amazing at writing, or it doesn't come that naturally to me. I have to really try. And so that was funny because I then saw reviews, and some of the reviews went, well, I wasn't expecting. It's too much for me, kind of thing. And then other reviews were going, I mean, it's pretty tame, but whatever. And so I thought, oh, well, I'm probably in the right zone then. If it's, you can't please everyone. If it's too tame for some and a bit racy for others, then I'm probably in the right place.
So you're writing in a number of cultures that are not your culture.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on authors, especially authors like the both of us who are, white, writing stories set in cultures that are not our own?
I think it's the same as I'm not a lesbian and I wrote a lesbian love story. I think everybody, I think a lot of people have not been allowed to tell their stories, and they should be much more encouraged and supported to do so, because especially traditional publishing has a nasty way of locking people out. So that would be good. But I also feel that imagination and research and empathy and intersectionality means that everybody ought to be able to write everyone else if you do it well. I think there are stumbling blocks, and you need to think to yourself, am I going to stumble here? Am I going to do something stupid and look bad or upset people? But I think if you approach that in I'm willing to learn and do the best job I can, usually it works out well. It's a difficult one. It's difficult, but I think if you always felt, oh, I can't write that because I'm not that, oh, I can't write the other thing. I mean, basically, then all I'm left with is writing a suburban mother in London, and that's going to get boring real quick.
Now, according to your bio, you wrote an academic thesis about balancing fact and fiction in historical fiction, which is really kind of part of the premise of this entire show. And it's tricky. So what would be your capsule advice to writers on that topic?
Um, to know why you're putting the fictional bits in, what your purpose was. And that was part of my thesis. I was arguing that people always ask, is it historically accurate? And I try to make mine as historically accurate as I possibly can based on what's available to me to research. But they never ask the other question, given that it's historical fiction, they never say, why did you choose to put that fictional bit in? Because of course you have to put some fictional bits in because you haven't got everything. There are some holes in there somewhere, so you got to plug them with something. But if you and I got exactly the same synopsis to write a novel from, we would put different fictional bits in because we would have made those choices. And my point was, why do you never ask, why did you make that fictional choice? Because the fictional choice is about something the writer was thinking about, in the same way that what exactly how you started asking me about was, what's the concept behind the consorts? And the concept for me was, there must be other lives within the Forbidden City than the concubine who's devoted to the emperor and the emperor's devoted to the, there must have been other women who took other routes through that life. And so that's why I chose different concubines and gave them different routes to happiness. So another historical author in the exact same era would have picked something else to focus on, I assume. So I think knowing why you put the fictional bits into the history tells you a lot about what attracted you to that era in the first place.
You've mentioned a Regency novel that's going to be coming out. Do you have any other projects in the pipelines that you wanted to talk about?
That's my main one at the moment. I focused on that one, and then I've started the next one while I'm waiting for the editor to come back with her comments. I've started the next one in that series. So it's called the Regency Outsiders series, and the idea is that each one, whilst I enjoy the tropes of Regency romance and I'll be leaning into those, each one of them is slightly an outsider in one way or another. And that's what makes them interesting to me, because otherwise it's a bit, what is there other than try and keep the hero and heroine apart long enough to then get them together at the end? You've got to have something a bit more interesting to that. And it allows me to explore other aspects of Regency. So first one that I've written has the initial hero is locked up for being mad, which, in those days covered an awfully broad spectrum of things, and the kind of treatments they had for that and things are pretty rough. So it's being able to explore those other aspects of Regency romance as well.
Yeah, I'm always fond of writing outsider characters, because
Yes.
a character who is not being benefited by the status quo is free to do a lot of things that someone who's part of the infrastructure is not free to do, or has chosen not to do.
Yes. And also, and this is one of the reasons I like historical fiction generally, you're often in a very tight box in a history. I mean, it's moving outside of that box is really difficult. So, when people go, oh, well, you weren't allowed to have an affair. Well, they had an affair anyway. You think, no. The 18th century China, if one of the concubines is found having an affair, this is a, life or death situation. It is not just, oh, well, never mind, naughty. And I think that being held in those much more rigid boxes actually makes it a lot more interesting to go, well, how do you either survive inside the box or break out of it?
So if people wanted to find you online, website, social media, where should they look?
So my favorite one is to just go to my website and everything will be there. So that's melissaaddy.com. You can find everything you want there, including 2 novellas, including this one. So the Consorts is available on there as a free download. So you can read it right away.
Well, that's fabulous. I'll put a direct link to it along with your website.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.